Welcome to Scoop and Scale, where we dish up the science and weigh facts about mostly equine nutrition. I'm Jill Jackson, lifelong equestrian, podcast producer, and owner of 3 ponies. I'm a dressage rider and at-home horse keeper, living the challenge of managing 3 easy keepers on multiple acres of Iowa pasture.
And I'm equine nutrition consultant, Dr. Claire Tunis of Clarity Equine Nutrition. I develop diet plans for horses ranging from metabolic seniors to Olympic athletes. I also consult for equine nutrition companies. I'm a scientist, dressage rider, and pony club mom.
Claire and I have been horse friends for almost 20 years, and we've been collaborating on this podcast for the past year. And like most good horse friends, we're always talking horses. We're always talking about the challenges of managing our horses, our riding struggles, feeding horses, and what's going on in the wider equine community. This podcast is a place for us to have conversations mostly about equine nutrition. It's for anyone who wants to make better choices when it comes to feeding their horses.
And before we get started, a quick disclaimer. The information in this podcast is general and not meant to replace the individualized advice of your own qualified equine nutritionist or veterinarian. And while I have a PhD in nutrition, I'm not a veterinarian and can't give medical advice.
Thank you for joining us and hope you enjoy the following episode. As an owner of easy keeping ponies, calorie intake is something I'm always managing, and at times this can mean limiting the amount of forage being fed. I use a number of different methods to make the hay they are eating last longer, including hay nets and hay balls. But horses being overweight and easy keepers are not the only reason to use nets. We're heading into winter, and a lot of pastures are closed for the winter, and horses move into dry lots, or they spend more time in their stalls. It will be muddy, snowy, and icy, and horse management changes are inevitable. There are lots of ways to provide your horse with food in a novel way, and lots of reasons to do this. We thought we'd take a look at different types of enrichment that we can give to our horses to help them eat more naturally and make their lives more interesting. So I use the term naturally loosely because obviously there's nothing natural about eating out of a hay net or a ball. So what is it about these options that make it more natural than just putting it on the ground or a traditional feeder?
Yeah, that's a good point, right? I mean, it is more natural because it makes the hay that we're feeding them last longer, right? So I think we have to remember that left to their own devices in their natural setting, horses would be grazing 16, 18 hours per day, the majority of the day. And some horses get that luxury now because they're turned out in pastures 24/7. Some are turned out during the day, come in at night, vice versa. And then some don't ever get turned out into pasture. And then some are, as you mentioned, are in pasture perhaps in the summer and then are not in pasture and are unable to graze during the winter because the pastures are too wet and what have you. And so suddenly they're in a more meal eating type situation. And it's not great for digestive health because their digestive tract, as we talked about in our last episodes on ulcers, really is designed to have this constant trickle of forage coming through. And when we meal feed forage and have them standing around for long times, we do increase their ulcer risk, we do increase their boredom, we do risk sort of causing hindgut disruption as well. And so the beauty of these kind of nets and balls you just briefly mentioned is that they have to work harder to get the hay out of those than they do when they're just fed hay loose in a feeder or loose on the ground. And so it makes their hay last longer. And, you might just put the restricted amount of hay that you're feeding in a net to make it last longer. You might put an entire bale in the net to last longer. We can talk about that. But what makes it more natural is that you're kind of simulating this slow trickle intake of hay. And, I saw this firsthand years ago. I used to keep a few hay nets on hand and sell them to clients and watched horses at a show, get put on hay nets, and they literally, their hay lasted them hours longer than the horses that were fed loose on the ground. So it can be a great way to make the same amount of hay last a lot longer, and therefore you're simulating that more natural eating tendency.
I mostly use hay nets for my ponies, but thinking back to when I was a kid, do you remember those cotton nets that had the massive holes? They were like 6 inches or 8 inches.
I know, I'd never seen anything like it. I came to the United States, 25 plus years ago, and those are the only hay nets I ever saw, at the feed store, ever being used. And I'd never seen anything like it because at the time, or when I was growing up in the UK, we were using the nylon nets with probably maybe like 2.5-inch holes. And we actually did have small hold hay nets. We didn't call them small hold hay nets, and we weren't slow feeding, wasn't really a thing. They were called haylage nets because in the UK we feed this stuff called haylage, which is like silage that's made specifically for horses, and they love it and they eat it really quickly. And so we had these tiny weeny hold hay nets. My trainer actually fed haylage to her ponies, and so she used these haylage nets. So I had seen those, and then I came to the States and these just massive hold things, and like I remember going to a horse show and I couldn't see the point. I mean, it was just useless.
Yes, those were pretty useless. Most of the hay fell out. I actually still have one, and I've been using it.
Do you? It's like an antique.
It is an antique. No, I've been using it to soak my hay, which is why my wash rack is a mess because all the hay falls out of it.
Oh, I get it now.
Yes.
I understand. These photographs you've been sending, I'm like, why is there so much hay everywhere? But now, yeah, I get it, because those hay nets do not keep the hay in the net.
Correct. I just thought they'd be better for soaking the hay because more water we get. I don't know. Anyway, they're useless. So what I use now has really small holes, which it says they're 1-inch squares, but they're way smaller than 1 inch. And
really,
yeah, they're pretty tiny and they're pretty thick nylon. So I think that makes the holes a bit smaller. But what are the pros and the cons of nets with different size holes? Let's start with talking about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty kind of like obvious, right? I mean, the larger the holes, the easier the hay comes out. Or, in the case of those cotton nets, you just look at the hay net and the hay falls out. By the time you've carried it to where you're going to tie it, the hay has fallen out. Versus the small hold hay nets, they take longer to get the hay out and the horses have to work harder. And that can be a challenge for some horses. And there's everything from, like I said, nets with like 2-inch holes down to, there are some, you mentioned having 1-inch holes. I think there are some that have even smaller than 1-inch holes. So there's a lot of options out there now for, and again, the rate of how quickly they can get the hay out is really the big difference between them. And obviously, if you want the hay to last longer, you put smaller holes, but then you can end up with frustrated horses too. So there is a bit of a balance there.
You mentioned frustrated horses. The pony I have, who's like 10 hands, if I use, in the winter, I will use the bale feeder for small square bales. And the first day when I take it out there, he always rolls on them, like front feet, tries to push it over, rolls his back on. Like, I don't know if it's excitement or he's just frustrated that I've brought a whole bale, but he can't actually eat it as quickly as he wants to. Anyway, so it is pretty funny to watch him do it because he does somersaults over the top of the bale. But too small, I find that if you're going to start feeding with hay nets full time, starting with something with a little bit bigger hole, doesn't have to be the old school massive holes, but starting with something that's a little bit easier till they get used to using the net. And then you can work down to a smaller net.
Yeah, for sure. That's definitely what I recommend. And I also suggest that actually, and many of the manufacturers do say this, don't just cold turkey get excited and go put all your hay in a net and hang it up, because that really will frustrate a lot of horses that have never had nets before. Like, put, at least half of their hay the way you've been feeding it, loose or whatever, and then put like half of it in the net, and then gradually increase the amount that goes in the net. And as you said, start with a slightly bigger hole, and then if you're finding that that's going to quickly work your way down. It depends on personality too. I will caution, there are some horses I actually wouldn't ever give a hay net to, because I have some senior horse clients that just don't have a lot of motivation to eat well anymore. And they're not horses that need slowing down. They're already, you're like, dude, come on, like eat all this hay, And so I wouldn't use a slow net for them. Or if I did use a net, I definitely use the larger holes. So yes, there's definitely considerations, but don't go cold turkey onto the smallest hole net you can find.
Does it matter what the nets are made out of?
Not really. I think some materials certainly last longer than others. I think your cotton net, if you're soaking it, it's going to rot pretty quickly. But, the nylon nets obviously are a little more rain resistant, if your nets are going outside, and perhaps a little bit stronger. Some nets, the squares are made by knotting the net together, the twine together, and so you do get knots. And I think in some of the kind of like waxed nylon type nets, that can be pretty rough. But then there are other nets that are not knotted, And so they're slightly less abrasive. So, it just sort of comes down to preference, different types of nets. And there are so many different types of nets out there now. There's something for everybody, right? You can experiment. I know you have lots of different kinds of nets, but
I do. And we'll talk about that for a second because Dash, my pony, he eats out of a net all the time. I've had him for 5 years. He has wear on his front teeth. And this is something that people talk about a lot about using nets and that it's going to affect their teeth. Maybe. Depends what it's made out of. I mean, the net that I use the most frequently, it's a nylon net and it has knots. And I've said this to my horse's dentist and to the vet. I would rather that he has wear on his teeth than has laminitis. I can work with no teeth.
That's fair.
I mean, if he has laminitis, like, it's just, you've got to take the lesser of two evils. Now, I've switched over to using cotton nets, which are a lot softer. They don't have knots in them, and there is a difference. So I guess what I would say is if teeth are a concern to you, then you should make sure you feel the net and see how abrasive it is, how rough it is. Some of the nets have dentist approval or vet recommended. You might look into that and see what they're actually made out of because there could be some validity behind that. But it definitely does make a difference what the material is and how it's woven or knotted together.
Right, for sure.
What about how you hang them? Because obviously horses naturally eat off the ground and you can't put nets on the ground for every horse because if your horse has shoes, you don't want them on the ground. And also if you have little ponies and you have big holes in your net, then you also need to watch for that. So let's talk about how to hang these.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think this is probably one of the sort of hot topics around nets, right? There's all kinds of conversation about, to your point, if they're shod, they shouldn't go on the ground. Even if the holes are really small and they couldn't get a whole foot through them, you could get the heel of a shoe through them. I think it was worth mentioning that Patrick, your 10-hand pony who likes to apparently wrestle hay bales in nets, he's not shod. So he's not going to get a foot through that net when you've put it on the ground. My big guy has shoes on. I'm not going to be putting nets on the ground for him, whereas my daughter's pony's barefoot. I don't worry about it so much, for him. So that's definitely a consideration. But then again, we want horses eating in their natural posture with their head down. It's important for their respiratory system so it can drain and stuff doesn't get up their nose or in their eyes, which can happen if you hang a net too high. So there's sort of this, where's the happy medium? So, I mean, I know I'm a good pony clubber, right? And we always teach our pony clubbers that when you hang a net, the bottom of the net when it's empty should not be any lower than the point of shoulder. That is a safe height to hang a net. They're very unlikely to get a foot in it if it's above the point of shoulder when it's empty. And the reason we say when it's empty is because if you think about it, a net full of hay is sort of like rounder, and when it gets empty it becomes longer, and so you can think you've hung it high enough when in fact you haven't. So that'll be dangerous when it's empty, even though it can look fine when it's full. So you certainly don't want to have it at eye level or above because stuff can fall in their eyes, and that is an unnatural eating height, right? They are lifting their head up and eating, and we do have to think about, I mean, you and I both ride dressage. We're a little paranoid about top lines and developing the top of the neck and not the under neck. And if the hay net's hung at the wrong height and they're always sort of pulling up, are they developing the wrong muscles? I mean, that's a concern people have. I mean, again, to your point, it's a little bit of a risk assessment, right? What's the bigger, you were worried about your horse is standing around for hours with no hay and potentially getting ulcers, or you're worried about he may not be using his top line in the perfect way, right? You can't have it all sometimes, right? And there has been I think there's actually some ongoing research that is looking at the effect of nets on, does it add strain to necks and things? Honestly, I can say I fed growing up horses out of nets, never perceived having a neck issue. I know you fed, as you said, Dash for 5 years out of a net. I've never heard you talk about a neck issue, but we also don't have horses with known neck arthritis, right? So I think perhaps it comes down to the individual horse and the common sense of different heights, different locations for what you have going on with your horse. But there are ways to hang hay nets low that are safe. You can secure them inside of a trough. So Somebody had put like a U-bolt in the bottom of a very large Rubbermaid water trough. The side of the trough is probably 2 feet high, and there was a U-bolt in the bottom, and then they snapped their hay net into the bottom of that. And so there was no way for the hay net to get pulled out of the water trough, and that horse would really have to like step over a 2-foot barrier to get its feet in it. It would have to be pretty motivated to get its foot in it. So there are clever ways to deal with that. I do believe that if you're hanging hay nets, tying them up, hanging them with a quick release knot is smart, just in case you need to get them down in a hurry. And talking about, thinking, well, my horse can't get its foot in the net if it's hung pretty high. I did have a friend when I was in high school whose mare did actually get her foot caught in a net because it wasn't hung at that, above shoulder height. And she did get her foot hung, and she spent a long time standing with her foot pretty high off the ground, probably 3 feet off the ground. And she strained all the muscles in her shoulder and was off for quite a long time. So, yeah, I think we have to be aware there are risks of using hay nets, but there are many really good benefits too.
Yeah, and I think we all last year saw the images on Facebook that people were at WEC doing night check, and same thing. The horse had kicked at the stall wall and got their shoe caught and was hung up, and they cut it down. And so knowing where the scissors are in your barn, making sure that if you're going to put your hay net up, that you've got it tied on a breakaway, something that's going to snap. Yes, it's not ideal if it is stuck on their shoe, but at least they're not hung up. The other thing is we're going into winter, or if you're going to shows, which is somewhere where people use hay nets a lot, that your blanket chest buckles, because not all of them feed through. They have a clip on them. Make sure those clips are facing in, or that you have, the Velcro cover over the front of them so that those don't get caught in the hay net also, if you're going to be hanging them.
So important.
Yeah.
That happened to me actually last winter. Again, other people blanketing, not us, and didn't know that. And he has snaps on the front of his, and he got himself snapped to his hay net. And pulled back, and luckily I had it attached in a way that it broke away and it came away, and he was fine. There was some blanket damage, and the hay net was not really fit to use anymore, but that's much cheaper than what could have happened. So that's a really good point, and something well worth thinking about. And just another plug for my pony clubbers. There's a reason why when you set up your tack room in Pony Club, you have to have a jackknife and a flashlight and a fire extinguisher right inside your tack room door. And they're always there, because then you know exactly where they are, and for emergencies, right? So,
and as does everybody else that's at that show, because they're all pony clubbers and they all put theirs in the exact same place in their tack room.
I'm showing this weekend, and I will have some emergency items right inside my show tack room. So it's ingrained into me, but it's, it is important. Like, things happen, right? Emergencies happen. And it's those moments where you're like, oh, dang it, where did I put my jackknife? Or where did the scissors go? There should be a jackknife or a pair of scissors that never gets used except emergencies, and it just lives in that place.
Are there any brands of nets that you particularly like?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've used several different kinds. As I said earlier, there are so many. But when I started out doing nutrition consulting, slow feeding nets were really quite new. And I think one of the first on the market, or at least certainly one of the first I was aware of, that gained quite a lot of traction was Freedom Feeder. And they're still out there. And I had one of their nets. And actually, I still have it. I don't use it every day. It was used in a trailer, and then I did end up using it in a stall as my daily net, and it lasted really well. It's a smooth net with no knots. It's hung, most of them are hung in a slightly unique way. They're a little bit like envelopes. The idea being is you can kind of hang them down the fence line and then fold the flap up, put your hay in, and then fold the flap down in the top. Some of them are huge. You can put quite a large amount of hay in. And then around the same time or not long thereafter, I think I became aware of hay chicks. And the thing that I like about their nets is they have a really cinch chicks, I think they're also known as, right? They literally cinch their nets shut. So they almost have what do you call this? Toggle things you have on your rain jackets for sliding up your hood strings. And you press it and you can slide the strings through it. And the strings and the gathering string is not a continuous loop because of this mechanism they have. And so you don't end up with this big loop at the end that a horse could put its foot through if you put the net on the ground. And a lot of their nets come with a snap-on that you can snap them onto the wall or snap them onto into a trough or something.
I actually bought 2 Hay Chicks bale feeders this year. So not for round bales. These are for the small squares. I had surgery in January and my husband was going to be feeding for me. So I wanted to make sure that it was as easy as possible because there was no way he was going to fill my regular 7 hay nets and hang them on the fence and put them in all the special
Right.
places for enrichment. So I did buy them and non-horse person used them, had no problem filling them. They were super easy. I mean, you
Oh,
just
good.
stand your bale up on its end and pull it down and then flip it over and use the toggle. And I like that the end, like you said, it's not a continuous loop. So you do have 2 strings at the end, but you don't have to worry about like feet getting stuck or anything like that. And I had them out all
Right.
winter and they held up really well. So,
Oh, that's good.
yep, I was
Yeah.
happy with those.
Yeah, and then there's kind of nets that are nets on one side and not on the other. So like I think of hay pillows, right? So hay pillow, they have like a canvas backing and then like a mesh top. The thinking being for people that are putting nets on the ground, you don't really want to put your traditional net on the ground if it's dirty, muddy, whatever, because obviously then one side of the hay is in the mud and the dirt. So it's kind of a clever idea. You've got this really heavy duty canvas on the bottom, which then keeps the hay off the ground and the horses are eating off the top. And yeah, so those are quite clever. And the mesh panels like Velcro on, and you can change them out and have slightly different sizes. So I think that's clever. I have seen horses figure out how to like stand on a corner and then eat, and they can get a lot more leverage then and like pull the hay out. But honestly, they could probably do that with any hay net if they were particularly smart. And then most recently, learned about a new hay net made by a company called Fat Pony Feeders. And it has a pretty genius closing mechanism. What I really like about that, and I haven't used them personally, I'd love to get my hands on one actually, and shout out to them because they listen to our show. But they have this draw cord that gets hidden away inside a really clever seam. So to the point about the Hay Chicks not having the continuous draw cord so you don't have that loop, it appears that the Fat Pony Feeders draw cord sort of like disappears into this seam. And so, yeah, I'd love to see how that works firsthand, but that's pretty unique.
It is. And it's also, I think about when it's -30 outside and I'm trying to pick up my nets and reopen them to fill them and the ice on them and how muddy and stuck and cold they are. I feel like having a cover over that would really help. So again, shout out to Fat Pony Feeders. We're going to hopefully give those a try. We talked about using hay nets to make restricted amounts of hay last longer, but I know some people put a whole bale, especially like I'm in Iowa, a lot of people feed round bales. So how do those work? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think for round bales, they're great, right? Because one of the biggest issues with round bales is you can lose up to like 50% of your bale. I see people all the time, they just like roll the bale out and just put it loose in the field, and most of it ends up as like just trod into the mud around the bottom of the bale. So I think if you could put a net on it, you would certainly save a lot of money in wasted hay. And you won't get that nice, what's that meme of the mini pony with its whole front half stuck out of the bale, round bale. They won't be able to do that if it's in the net. Again, the premise there, putting bales out is so that they really have forage in front of them 24/7 and they can't sort of eat it all at once. And, there is this thinking that horses gobble their hay and go through it in a couple of hours because they're meal fed and they're stressed about when am I getting my next meal? And then the meal shows up and they just sort of shove it down their throats kind of thing. And the thinking is that if they had continuous hay in front of them, that stress would disappear and then they would learn to kind of come and go. There's always hay there. I don't have to stress about meal times, and their cortisol levels would drop, and then potentially this would influence their insulin and all those kinds of things. It's a great idea. It does work for some horses. Again, the recommendation is you have to keep the hay in front of them and they must never run out, because if they do, then that stress comes back. Well, that's great. And I have seen it work for some horses. We always say horses should eat, 1.5 to 2% of their body weight in forage per day. And I have been to situations where clients have told me, I don't know how much, hay I feed. I just free feed. And I've sort of said, well, I'd like to know roughly how much that is. And so they've actually weighed what they've put in the net, and then they weigh what's still in the net when they go back out to put more hay in the net. And we did the math, and sure enough, they were eating 2% of their body weight. However, so it's self-regulated to that. However, I also have plenty of clients who, 2 months, 3 months or more are still waiting for their horses to self-regulate. And in the meantime, their horses are now obese and are overweight. And so the bottom line is, it's a great concept. It works for some horses. It does not work for all horses. So you have to know your horse and feed accordingly. But certainly, in large group situations where you have large numbers of horses out in a field together eating off a round bale, that sort of a thing. Or like for you, when you were saying you were going away and you had sort of a pet sitter type situation, someone coming in for 2 days and didn't want to have them having to worry about hanging hay nets and things, being able to put basically 2 or 3 days worth of hay out at one go, so they didn't have to worry about that, and they could just check the horses over and make sure they were sort of healthy and happy, but didn't have to worry about putting the hay out. I think those are great opportunities for those bale nets, for sure.
Yeah, for sure about waste. When the hay is loose on the ground, around here in the winter, it's a really nice bed when I always say this, when it's -30 outside, nobody wants to lay on the ground. So you see the hay net or the hay bale has kind of exploded, and then there's horses bedded down in all that loose, right? And it's like, they're not going to go back and eat that. And then they're peeing on it on top of it and stepping on it and everything else. So yes, there's waste. And I see the same thing, even though I have ponies, because I let my hay go past maturity. There is some part of that hay that they're not eating, those big, thick, hollow stems. And so you can see that when I leave those bales out that they've picked through and just left all those hollow bits. So I definitely think that putting it into the net helps with waste.
For sure. And like you're in the sort of slightly enviable position, right? That you grow your own hay and hopefully have more hay than you know what to do with. So you're not so worried about the waste factor. But obviously, for boarding barns and things, it's a big deal, right? I mean, it's just dollars on the ground.
I was going to say, yeah, if you were running a boarding business, there's no way that you could let that much waste happen. And
yet I see it. I mean, I do see people, it's shocking to me, right? Because we hear barn owners saying that the cost of running boarding facilities is so expensive, and it is. And like food is like your biggest overhead. And then I, drive past facilities like you're saying, like where they've got horses out in situations where they've hay all over the ground and sleeping on it. And, again, it is just dollars on the ground.
Yeah. When I feed with my hay nets, so in the winter when my horses are on the dry lot, it's not a very big, I'd say it's maybe a half an acre. And I hang my nets. I put some of them on the fence. I put some of them on the ground. I fill the hay ball, but I put them all in separate areas in the paddock so that they have to walk around. One, so they keep moving to stay warm and just to keep their joints going, but also just to give them something to think about and something to do. So I know that not everybody does that, but there's actually systems. There's a thing called a track system, and I'm on some of the Facebook groups for that. I know in the UK this is really big, but I know a lot more people in the US are starting to look into putting in track systems. So do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, they can really be. Some of those systems, I think it's a couple I've seen like in the Netherlands, they're amazing. I mean, talk about enrichment, right? Talk about enrichment. So what they are is, let's say, and they started off, I think, for people that, had pretty small acreage, and they, in a way to try and give their horses more area to move around in, you basically cross fence and fence within the acreage that you have. So you basically create like a strip or a road, right? And they have to walk then, instead of being able to walk, let's say you had a square field. Instead of being able to walk diagonally across the field, let's say you have hay nets hung in diagonal corners, with nothing else there, they could just walk from one hay net to the other straight across the field. But in a track system, they'd be forced to walk the perimeter to get there. So now they've had to walk 2 sides of the square to get to the other hay net rather than across the middle of the square on the diagonal. It forces them to move and cover more ground.
And you see people put things along the track, which is fun. So I've seen ones that have logs. So they have, I say logs, they're not logs. They're like trotting poles that are just laid down. So they have to lift
I've seen railroad sleepers.
Yeah. So they have to lift their feet up, so they're moving their joints in different ways. And there's watering stations along the way that have different flavors of water. Anyway, it's really interesting. People are very creative with this. And so if you do have a small space, there are lots of Facebook groups and websites that have information about how to set up a track system and to get started. And I think
Yep.
I think they're really fun.
Yeah, and I mean, just the mental enrichment, right? I've seen like people put tires on the ground that the horses have to step through the tires, and it means they have to use their brains, right? It's physically good because they have to pick their feet up, but they have to use their brains as well. And I've also seen people intentionally plant different kinds of herbs and things along the way. And horses learn that, there's a bramble patch over here and they like brambles, so they'll go eat brambles, or they'll go over here and eat something else. And so there's, again, just lots of different enrichment type opportunities. And sometimes they'll open out, if you have more area, they'll open out into larger spaces. So they have kind of communal spaces that are more easy to run around in a little bit versus always having to be on a kind of straight line. But no, they're really clever. And I had a client who used one very successfully actually to help her horse lose weight. She actually had hers on the side of a hill, so he had to really go up and down and up and down, and it really helped him lose weight. His house was at the top of the hill, and I think like the food was at the bottom, and so like he had to go up and down all day long. And we had that in our pastures growing up. I mean, our water source was at the bottom of the hill, the view was at the top of the hill, the food was at the top of the hill, and so even though I only rode like 2 days a week in the winter, the horses stayed pretty fit because they was going up and down the hill all the time. So
Hills are great. We don't have any hills in Iowa. It's very flat, but someday.
Don't have any hills where I am either. I can see hills, but you can't even see them.
So there are lots of innovative slow feeders on the market now, and I think we should talk about some of those because I think that it will help people get over the stigma around posture and teeth and health issues associated with feeding this way, because they are great for horses. They do help with enrichment. They help with boredom. And I really think that a lot of people have it stuck in their mind that these are just for fat, overweight horses that just need to eat less or eat slower.
Yeah, no, I agree. And they can be for all horses, right? I mean, I think just flashing back to our ulcer episode again, like they're, regardless of the horse you have, they're a great way of helping to potentially reduce the risk of ulcers and things. So yeah, other types of slow feeders. I mean, we've hinted at earlier the hay ball. I've got one of those too. I thought our pony was going to love it, and he's not a massive fan of it. I may have messed up. I got really enthusiastic. I put his whole dinner in there, like a big 6-pound flake. You can get a lot of hay in these things. They're kind of like, think of like a sphere, except for they're not completely round, right? They have lots of flat sides on them, and each flat side has a hole in it. And then there's like a cork, like screw in cover, the stopper basically, right? That you take out that you use to shove the hay in. Well, I got very excited and I shoved like an entire flake in there and thought, this is amazing. I can get like 6 pounds of hay in this thing, and screwed it on and threw it back in the stall. And I came out the next morning, the poor guy, he had only been able to eat, I had so much hay in there, it didn't move around enough. And so he could only eat the hay he could actually get to. It didn't as he ate it, it didn't get pushed to the other side. So it wasn't up against the holes on the other side. I'd packed it too full. So I'll just throw that out there as a cautionary tale. I came out to a pony who was very upset about the fact that he really said he hadn't been able to eat hardly any of his dinner. And I had a hay bowl that just had all these like divots in it. Every hole had like a nose-sized divot in it where he just like been able to eat some of the hay, but not all the hay. If you don't fill them really full, the hay is able to move around in the bowl, and as they're eating out of one hole, it shifts to be against the hole on the opposite side, and then they roll the bowl around with their nose and can get to the hay on the other side. So great for stalls, great for dry lots. Obviously not going to be so great in the mud because they're going to be rolling it around and potentially making like a snowman type situation if you've got really muddy conditions underfoot. And some horses do learn how to like trap them in the corner so they don't roll and then eat out of them, so the rolling component's gone, but it's still going to slow them down.
One disclaimer on these: if you have very little ponies, the holes are fairly big, so just make sure that if you have minis, foals, anything that's got small feet, that they don't have access, because they could potentially get a foot in it if they were little.
I also think there's a potential they could get their jaw, the lower jaw, through the hole. True. If you've got a really, really fine, like a mini, or to your point, a foal. Common sense, right? Just yep. look at the holes, look at the size of horse you're thinking of feeding. Another kind of interesting feeder that offers a ability to roll things around if the horse wants to, are porter grazers. So these are basically really heavy duty barrels, and they have a lid that drops in and kind of locks in place, and that lid, as the hay goes down in the barrel, the lid drops with it, and the lid has holes cut into it. And they have a couple of different sizes of lids, so the circular holes are different sizes. They're fun because, they can knock them over and roll them around. I did have a client who used one with her horse and got complaints from her neighbor because her horse liked to roll it around in the middle of the night and would clunk it into the barn wall and the fencing. And the neighbor, she lived in a fairly high density housing sort of area with small horse properties, and the next door neighbor kept being woken up at night by this horse banging its porter grazer into the barn wall. So she had to get rid of her porter grazer. People really love the porter grazers. I will say, I find if your goal is to really slow horses down, they're not the slowest slow feeder. And so what I'll do is I'll have clients put their hay in a hay net and then put the hay net in the porter grazer. So now you have a hay net with the lid over the top, and that really slows them down.
But if you're looking for enrichment, it sounds like it's good fun.
It is good fun because it rolls around all over the place. So and you can put quite a lot of, and they are big, and they're barrel size, so you can get quite a lot of hay in them. And then there's another one a bit like it that's made by Hay Gain. That's called the Forager Slow Feeder. Similar concept. Hay Gain is really into respiratory health, and so what they did with theirs is there's kind of vents throughout the barrel, so there's more airflow. So that if your horse is eating with its head basically in a barrel, for a long period of time, there could be restricted airflow. And so this has vents in it, so that's not an issue. Pretty clever. I'm not sure if these are still available in North America. I know they're still available in the UK. So people would have to, if they wanted to look at the Hay Gain Forager, they'd have to just kind of double check that they're still in the US. And then there are the box type feeders, similar idea, some kind of plastic screen with holes in. I think these really came about with people being concerned about feet, right? Getting stuck in nets. It's like, how can we feed them at ground level and get rid of the net problem? And so these are, plastic boxes, some of which are big enough to put a bale in. They have varying kinds of grates that you put on the top with different sizes of holes. One that people like is called the Savvy Feeder. That one I know is quite well received. I do sometimes wonder with all of these plastic grate type feeders, what impact that has on teeth. I mean, you were mentioning about the knots in your nylon nets. That's my only concern, as well. But to your point, sometimes it's just sort of a risk assessment. And then the last one I know of that's quite ingenious. I mean, it's called the Hay Optimizer. I actually had an opportunity to trial one of these, and they're big. I mean, they're a four-sided box that you could easily have four horses eating out of it at the same time. It's again like a really heavy duty plastic. It has legs that you can change the height on it, so you can have horses eating. If you have minis, you could have it lower than if you have warm bloods, kind of thing. It's really nice in that regard. It is a net on the top, and there's a metal frame that the net fits into. But what they've done a really good job at is the sort of engineering, so to speak, on how you lift the net up on that metal frame to fill it with hay is really clever. Like, you can literally do it with like one finger and one hand, which if you're a stubborn horse person like me and you're schlepping out into the field with, 5 flakes of hay balanced on your one hand and you want to open the feeder with the other hand, you can do that with this. And because they're a Canadian company, it works with your gloves on.
As it should. Those Canadians, they're pretty smart.
So yeah, there's no, fumbling around with trying to get the thing open and having to, touch the metal frame and, having to take your gloves off to do it in minus whatever temperature you're feeding horses in. So they now have a new stall version as well, which is kind of interesting. So that's another option.
I just want to say that there's so many DIY hay feeders that you can make at home. You can find, there's lots of Facebook groups that have these. You can look on Pinterest, but I've seen so many different fun ways of doing it. Taking a laundry basket, just like the plain foldable laundry baskets that have holes in them, and setting that in your hay net and then filling it with hay and then closing it up. And it makes like a big cube. that you just
Huh.
throw out to your horses. And so then, it sort of rolls. It's got all the sides on it. You can get different size laundry baskets and you can use different size hay nets. Like that's a pretty easy, go to the dollar store, cheap way to make an enrichment toy without having to spend a lot of money. You can also make it like I've seen people do them with pallet wood, breaking down the pallets that they got free pallets, made a square, and they just used trellis. And so they set their hay bale in and then they had, slits on each side. They left a gap so they could slide a piece of trellis from Home Depot through, and then the horses just ate out of the top of that. So don't feel like you have to go spend money and buy an already finished product. There are so many ways that you can be creative and make something fun at your house if you're a DIYer.
That's very true. I would just caution, when you do the DIY thing, I mean, I've seen people make them. They've used like hog panel, metal grating and things on boxes, wooden boxes and things. And that really would worry me with teeth, eating against the metal grate. And I will just caution that trellis sometimes has staples in it to hold the trellis pieces together. You just have to be sensible. Yeah, I mean, pallets are amazing. I saw a picture somebody made an entire backyard lawn furniture couch thing out of pallet. It was amazing. But they do have nails in and things. So, again, common sense, right? Like it's horses, some laundry bar. You've got a destructive horse, like mine apparently is a destructive horse. I found out this morning, but that's another story. Probably the laundry basket, he'd probably sit on it and shatter it and the plastic would fall apart. And that is, I mean, I will say that is what you get. I mean, some of these feeders, they seem really expensive, right? But the quality of the plastic that they're using, like I live here in the heat, you've got the cold. Plastics don't always do well when they're out in the elements and they do start to shatter and fall apart. And these plastics that these companies are using they're expensive, right? They're heavy duty plastics. They're not going to fall apart just because they sat outside for 12 months. So you do sometimes get what you pay for, and you might not get that with a home DIY. But yeah, there's lots of ways to configure slow feeders at home.
There is a new product that came out on the market this year from Equine, which is Green Guard Equine. They make the grazing muzzles. And they designed a slow feeder, and it's called the Hay Play. And this looks like a big rubber pillow. It's a good size. It comes in 2 different sizes. It has 3-inch holes, and the rubber is soft. It sort of looks like beach ball material. Obviously, you can get the specs on their site. It's not beach ball. It's heavy duty, so the horses can't bite through it. But it just is a big pillow that you put out. Multiple horses can graze off it at the same time. Big one can hold up to 10 flakes of hay. Wow. So that's massive, right?
Yeah.
And I think that it's really great. It can go in your stall. It can go outside. It does come, you don't have to get a 10 flake one. I think the smaller one is 3 to 5 flakes. But I think that that's a really interesting, again, not thinking about for heavy, overweight horses or horses that you need to reduce it, just for enrichment. That can easily go in the stall, give them something to do, make their hay last longer. Again, it's GG Equine. I think that that's something, a neat one to check out if you're just looking for something to offer some enrichment for.
Yeah, one thing I didn't, you're mentioning again, the horses that don't need their weight managed quite the same. And one thing I should have mentioned earlier, and I didn't when I was talking about the, allowing horses to free feed hay and that kind of thing. One of the keys to that is you have to have the right quality of hay. And you sort of hinted at the fact that, you grow your own hay and you let it get pretty mature and pretty stemmy, right? That's perfect hay to be free feeding, right? To allow horses unrestricted access to, because it has very low nutritional value. The biggest problem people run into when they use, these large nets, like you were just talking about the 10 flakes or whatever, and putting that out in front of their horse. If that's rocket fuel hay, really easily digestible, early cut, early maturity, second cut type hay that's really high in calories and nutritional value. Sure, if you put that in front of your horse unlimited, most horses are going to, get overweight on that. So a big part of the free feeding hay in hay nets type, conversation needs to be, what kind of hay are you putting in those hay nets? And it needs to, if you're going to feed unlimited amounts of hay to most horses, it's going to need to be a lower nutritional value hay. So I think that's a really important thing to think about if you're going to use these big, 10 flake nets with only one horse. It's different if you've got a 10 flake net and 5 horses eating off of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And again, I do grow my own hay. I know that not everybody is in the situation to feed unlimited hay and have hay in front of their horses 24 hours a day, but I do get it tested. I do grow it past maturity for this exact reason, that when we get to very long, dark days and very limited
They're coming.
turnout, that they can eat as much as they want and I don't have to worry about it. So I would say if you are trying to go to this style of feeding, then, getting your hay tested. We do have episodes on hay testing and also on growing hay, so check those out. But yes, you do have to have the right hay of a lower quality to be able to feed as much hay as I do.
Right. And, and if you've got the higher quality hay, then again, it's a matter of then you're restricting the total amount of hay you're feeding. You're just now using these methods to make it last longer. So there are stall toys for enrichment. I know your ponies really like the amazing Graze horse toy.
They do. This is a weird looking tubular toy. It has one hole in it, one circle. I think it's about a 1-inch hole. And the top of it opens up and you can put any treats in there that you want to. So you want to cut up fruit, you want to put hay cubes, horse treat, whatever you want to put in there. You just dump it in as much as you want. And they roll it around and there's only one hole for those to come out of.
Yeah, they have to work pretty hard.
So
that is truly enrichment. Yeah.
So I usually drop a handful I put a mix of alfalfa pellets and whatever treats I have on hand. And I drop those in usually in the afternoon. I just put them in, I put it out there, and they will roll it until there is no more little clinking noise of treats in there.
Yeah, they learn to associate the rattle with there's still one in there, and they will just keep going. And, I really think about, gosh, I was an undergraduate when I first learned about enrichment, and it was in the context of feeding zoo animals, right? I mean, again, talk about animals we've taken out of their natural environment and, no longer get to hunt or no longer get to, do the behaviors that they would in the wild for their food. And so zoos have become extremely good at finding enrichment methods. And like the amazing Graze really reminds me a lot of, those kinds of, like they actually have to really think about it. And it's not, they don't know when one's going to fall out, right? They don't know when they're going to get the reward. So, if you're into behavior, that's a really strong motivator because it just kind of keeps going because at some point they get a reward and it's random. So they don't know. So they keep going.
I will also say with that it also uses their other senses because I will watch them and they'll be rolling it along. And then all of a sudden they stop and they back up. And they're sniffing the ground because they know that one has fallen out. And so they have to go back and look for it. And it's a little bit of hunting for their one little treat. And yeah, it provides quite a bit of activity. And like I said, if you find stuff I use low sugar treats, you can use whatever you want in there. It doesn't matter how many I put in there. You put a handful of alfalfa pellets. You know how many that is. It's a bunch.
Right.
And for 2 ponies, they're out there for a long time hunting things down.
Do they share? I have to ask.
So usually when I fill it up, it's whoever gets there first. They both come running. As soon as I drop it in, they will both come right over to it. And then it's a little bit of nose battling. And then one of them says, okay, it's your turn. And the other walks away.
Yeah. Interesting point about the senses, because I really believe, and I've seen this, I've had clients tell me, and I've seen it personally. If you give horses hay in a net and hay loose on the ground, they will often choose to eat the hay out of the net first.
Every single time.
Yeah, you agree?
Every single time. I can have both, because I do, like I said, I'm feeding for enrichment, I'm feeding unlimited. And if I put hay loose on the ground and put hay in the nets, they will always go to the net first.
And I have a hypothesis about why that is. And I think it's because when they eat
Lay it on us.
When you see a horse eating out of a net, watch how they use their muzzles and watch how a horse uses its muzzle when it's grazing grass. It's very similar, right? When they eat grass, they kind of waffle their noses around and they're kind of working out, I want to eat this plant, but I don't want that plant. And it's a nose workout, right? And when you put hay loose on the ground, in my experience, what happens is quite often they just literally come at it with their mouth open and it's just kind of like, oh, like let's just like mouthfuls of hay. And horses don't eat grass like that. That's not grazing, right? Horses graze. And I just wonder whether there is a feel-good component to using their noses the way they do when they're using a hay net. And we know that there are ways to release endorphins from, stimulation of the nose. And so I just wonder whether that muzzle movement that's associated with grazing that they also use with nets actually ends up releasing endorphins and making them feel good. So I don't know if that's really true or not, but that's my hypothesis. And I just think it's really interesting. And I've had so many people observe the same thing, that horses choose to eat out of nets even when there's loose hay available.
Yeah, like I said, I 100% agree. And I challenge anybody to take a look at that. I mean, put some hay in a hay net and put some regular hay next to it, and you will see the difference in how they use their muzzle and wiggle it along the top of the hay net to get that hay out, as opposed to the hay that's just on the ground that they're just munching.
Right. And then there's things you can hang, right? So I think we've all seen like the Lickets, and more recently, I think it's Shires has something called a carrot ball horse toy that you shove long carrots in and then you hang it, suspend it from the ceiling of your stall. And of course, it moves around when the horse tries to grab the carrots out of it. So that kind of keeps them motivated. My horse has just like a solid ball like that I think is supposed to have some sort of Licket thing hanging from it. I'm not quite sure. I didn't buy it. It came with him. And he just seems to smack his head on it, to be honest, more often than anything else. I never really see him play with it, but occasionally I think he forgets where it is and walks into it. So, but anyway, I do think it's worth, if you do like the Lickets, reading the label, because some of them are more sugar in than others and wouldn't be appropriate for horses that are metabolic, because even though in theory they're supposed to lick them, some of the horses do figure out how to get hold of them and consume them pretty quickly. So just kind of throw that out there as a caution with those. But those are fun, stimulating, something to do. They're hard work. There's brain activity involved,
I'm just going to add on that there are some of those that are listed as no sugar added. That does not mean there's not sugar in them.
Yes, very true. I mean, if they're full, I've seen them with like grain and, like
molasses.
Right. And yeah, exactly. What is that? It's sugar, and, lots of grain, lots of high starch ingredients. Okay. It may not have any sugar in it, but if it's full of starch, it's still going to elicit an insulin, spike and be inappropriate for some of those metabolic horses. So yeah, that's a good thing to keep in mind.
I'm going to chime in here with a DIY horse Licket. I had a horse that went on 9 months of stall rest. I feel like every time I talk about my horses, they always sound like they're just sick and dying. I swear they're not. Anyway, different horse, not the horse I have now. He had 9 months of stall rest, and so it was really important that we found activities for him to do. And I went to the grocery store and bought turnips. For anybody that doesn't know what a turnip is, it's a root vegetable. It is round. They can get fairly big, and it looks like a big ball. And I took it and I took the drill and drilled a hole through the center of it. And I tied twine. I put twine down through it, and then I tied a big knot at the bottom. And I made a bunch of these, and I hung them from the ceiling in a stall, and I hung them on the bars in the stall, and they would swing around. And he could eat them. He'd have to try to catch them to bite them, but they're very, very hard. And so he'd only get, a few scrapes off it every time. But I made those for him, and they're not something that goes rancid, that goes bad.
Right.
So they could just hang there. And so again, if you want to not buy some sugary, or you don't want to spend the money, turnips are cheap and very easy enrichment to make at home.
Aren't they called rutabagas or something? Is that the same thing? I don't know. I know them as turnips as well, but I think they're called rutabagas or something. I'm probably slaughtering. I'm probably slaughtering how you pronounce that. Don't rely on the English person for the pronunciation of this vegetable or what have you. But in England, I did the same thing. It was a really commonly recommended thing for stall enrichment growing up to do the turnips. We also did Swedes. I don't really see Swedes in American grocery stores, and they're not Swedes like people from Sweden, just to be clear. It's another kind of root vegetable that you could also hang up. Yeah, similar. The horses really enjoy them.
Per Google, they are not the same thing.
Oh, they're not?
They're in the same family, and sometimes they're called white turnips, but they are not the same. There you go. Thank you, Google.
Yeah, so if you can't find turnips in your store, those other things, rutabagas or however you pronounce them, also will work. But you tried carrots as well, didn't you? Hanging carrots?
I did, and it was a challenge to use the drill and drill through the turnip. The carrot, I mean, I tried to get some really big carrots. They just would split when you tried to put the drill through them. So I would say the carrot ball that Shire's made, or whatever company's making the carrot ball that you just stick the whole carrot through, probably a better option. Don't try and put the drill through. It just makes a mess.
Yeah, that does sound really messy. Yes. But you know what? That's it kind of this is how bright ideas are made, right? Is that someone wants to hang carrots from the ceiling and they spend hours drilling carrots and they realize there has to be a better way. And unfortunately, it wasn't you that figured that out. It was Shire's. So next
Good
time.
Good job, Shires.
Yeah. So there's also, for grain, there's some kind of enrichment things for grain or for horses that eat too fast and are likely to choke. There's something called a drop and slow for grain buckets. It's a plastic insert with a bunch of big lumps. A lot of our listeners may have heard about putting like smooth river rocks in your grain pans so the horses have to work around the river rocks. And that's certainly a way to do it. But there's this sort of thing called a drop and slow that goes in the bottom of the grain bucket, and they have to work the grain around the lumps. So that's really good if you've got a horse that eats its grain way too quickly. They don't fit in all grain buckets though. So another option is called a prevent feeder, which is actually the bucket as well. And instead of lumps in the bottom of the bucket, it's like divots in the bottom of the bucket. And so the grain ends up in all of these like divots, and the horse has to work to, get the mouthfuls of grain out of all the like indentations in the bottom of the bucket. So they're really clever and they really help with horses that eat their grain too fast. But all of these things we've been talking about, I get pushback from clients when I suggest implementing some of these things, especially people that are in boarding facilities, because I think they really think that their barn is not going to be on board with it, right? The feedback's going to be, it's going to take too long to fill hay nets. They're too tricky. We don't want the staff doing it. They don't have time, all those kinds of things. But I don't know. I mean, you feed from nets and slow feeders all the time. Like, what's your experience?
I'm going to start with a quote from Fat Pony Feeders, which I think is really spot on. Whatever slow feeder you use should take you less time to load than what it takes for the horse to empty. And I can't agree with this statement more. So, yes. Is it going to take longer than picking up 3 flakes of hay and throwing them over the stall wall? Yes. Does it take a lot of time? No. I think that there's a lot of good options out there to make filling the hay nets easier. One, I would say that the smaller the holes are, or the stiffer that the netting is, the easier they are to fill. So I have a net that I use right now. It's probably smaller than 1 inch. It's nylon. When I open it up, I don't even break my flakes up. I literally pick up 4 flakes of hay and slide 4 flakes of hay in. I mean, the hole is that big on the top. So there are plenty, and I think that the design of them has gotten better, that they are much easier to fill. But I've seen people use the rolling laundry baskets, the ones that, you use for college. They have a handle that comes up. They're tall. Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're about 36 inches. So you could take one of those and set your hay net in it, fold the top over, put the drawstring through the rolling handle, and then just drop your hay in. And then you just pull the drawstring up. So that's an easy way. There's a leaf bag chute. So this is what people use to pick up the leaves in the fall. And it's like a 3-sided board. So there's a flat side and then 2 sides roll up. You can stick that into your hay net and then just slide your hay flakes down into it. If you're hanging nets, depending on the type of net you're using, I have some that they're not the freedom feeders, but they're a little bit like that. Like they're hooked up on the side of the fence and they just open like an envelope, like a pocket. And so you just pull
Right.
out one side and you drop it in. Those do come in different sizes also. So obviously the bigger the net you get, the more hay you can put in there, the bigger the
Right.
opening is to put hay in there. But I think the first couple times you fill a hay net, you're going to struggle a little bit until you've done it a few times. But I fill hay nets every day for every feeding, multiple hay nets, different kinds of hay nets. I don't find that the struggle is real. I think that it's
It's having a system is part of it, right?
right.
It's once you have your system down. And, that's kind of what I say to people in boarding facilities. It's, you kind of have to work with, kind of find different solutions. I mean, and I think that like when I was boarding at a barn and wanted to use hay nets, and I kind of knew that it was unlikely that they were going to fill a net and hang a net or hang it, the way I wanted it hung or whatever. I realized that the front of our stalls were actually 5-bar metal gates and freedom feeder. And I think the hay chicks as well, they feed, like they have a hoop, and it's a metal hoop that you weave the hay net onto. And then I basically zip tied the metal hoop to the opening between. It fit perfectly for my gate. So I had the metal hoop was against one bar and against the bar below it, with the opening to the outside of the stall. And so it kind of created like this, basically you just posted the flake into like a mail slot basically, and the net was then on the inside and just leant against the gate. Super easy. In fact, it took no more time for them to put the flake into that net than it did to throw it over the gate to try and get it in the Rubbermaid tub that he had in his stall for having hay put in when it was loose. So often it's just a matter of, trying to figure out how you can do the brunt of the work, right? How you can make it easy for your barn and make it so that it's not, the onus is not on their stuff, right? Make it easy for them.
I'm going to add two things here. So one, this is something that I don't think about because I just do it every day, but I have a garden wagon. So this is like the type of wagon that you would get at the garden center that you set trays of flowers in. It's about 24 inches off the ground and it has 6 or 8 inch walls on it. It's got big wheels. I take every bale, I feed small bales, I set it in there and then I cut it. So my bales don't ever flop apart. They're always contained in there. So when I go to pick up to feed, I set the hay net on top of half of the bale. I pick the flakes up. They're still in the actual square. They're not falling over. I don't have to bend down. So that's something to think about if you haven't thought about getting a hay wagon. That can definitely help keep it contained while you're filling. And the other thing was like I went to a show out of state. I had to board somewhere, which I don't normally do. I normally have my horses here, but it is important for me to feed in hay nets. And so the person that owned the facility, I didn't want her to have to mess with them. I didn't want to ask her to fill my hay nets. So I just filled 3 hay nets and I left them there for her. And every day when I went, I just filled them. So all she had to do was pick them up. My horse is not shod, so I just had them tied so there was no end on them. I just kept looping them through themselves. So all she had to do was throw the hay net in. They were already all loaded. And so that's something else. If your barn staff doesn't want to fill your hay nets for you, or maybe you don't want your horse to eat all of its hay in the hay net, if you just want to give it 1 hay net a day, just fill it for your barn staff and have it ready for them. And then they don't have to worry about it.
Right. And there's definitely going to be barns where, I know there are barns where they don't want their boarders in the hay barn, right? Like they're just not going to let you do that. And so there are, I'll just admit there are going to be places where it's not going to work, right? And hay nets is not going to be, or slow feeder hay systems are not going to be viable. And so that's where some of the other things we've been talking about come in as well. But I will say that, if you're getting pushback from barn owners about the fact that their staff are going to don't have time, they're going to be spending more time filling hay nets and all those kinds of things. And the reality is that yes, they may be spending a bit more time filling hay nets, but as you've found, once you've got your system down, you can do that pretty quickly. They will save time mucking out. And likely the barn will save money in hay waste, like we talked about earlier, even when it's not in a pasture, even when it's a barn type setting.
Yeah, I agree with this 100%. So I am on a turn out during the day, the horses are stalled overnight. And the pony that likes to do the somersaults on the hay nets, if I give him hay on the ground, he puts his front feet in it and drags it before he starts eating. He drags it into the middle of the shavings, and then he starts eating. And then he drags it from here and he drags it there, and he trashes his stall. So when I go to muck in the morning, it's funny, all of his manure is in one spot, but he's peed on top of the hay, and the hay is all mixed in with the shavings. So his stall, even when I get all the wet and the manure out, it still looks a mess because there's hay mixed in everywhere. And it's just a waste. And that's his preference for how he wants to eat. Like, again, if I just put it in a net, it doesn't happen.
Right. So you're wasting money on bedding. It probably takes you a lot longer to muck out because,
For sure.
you're trying to get those little bits of hay because you want it to look like you mucked out, where otherwise it looks like you didn't even try. And so, the time spent and the money spent on bedding and wasted hay, honestly, pays for the extra time staff is spending filling hay nets. So, I think if you can get through people's resistances and even just try it, do an experiment in a handful of horses in the barn. And I know barns that have done that, right? We'll just take these 5 stalls and we'll do hay nets for them and we'll just trial it and see how it works. Invariably, they end up all switching all the horses to some kind of slow feeder system in the end.
Yes, I agree with that. And again, I don't think that everybody shouldn't go out and harass their barn owners and their barn managers about using hay nets.
True.
Please don't do that. Please don't send them back and tell them we told them. Yes, but these are just some options that if your horses maybe need the nets for slower feeding, or if you're just looking for some enrichment, we're just offering you suggestions and ways to maybe overcome some obstacles. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything else that we should discuss?
I just think it's really important. I want people just to remember that we've really taken our horses out of their natural habitat, right? They don't belong in stalls. They don't belong meal eating. And, the reality is that life in stalls can be boring. And just understanding that there are things we can do to help, simulate their natural eating habits and stimulate their brains, right? So, and I think it's worth mentioning when we've talked all about these food enrichment products, but there are non-food related forms of enrichment, for example, like jolly balls, stall toys. Like a lot of people are really getting into like using like the dog toys, like the tug of war ropes and things, and kind of having them in their horses' stalls to play with. A lot of horses like to play with things. So, I just encourage our listeners to consider how they can enrich their horses' lives this winter, especially as we start moving horses being into more stalled environments with less turnout and things, and either through food-related activities or other toys.
If you're interested in any of the products that we've discussed in this episode, we did reach out to the manufacturers, and some of them have provided promo codes, which are in the show notes for our listeners to use. And if you'd like to be a part of our conversation, please send suggestions for future topics and equine nutrition questions to info@scoopandscale.com and is spelled out. You can also find Claire at clarityequine.com.
If you've enjoyed this episode, we'd be thrilled if you'd share it with your friends on social media, and be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform.
For the Scoop and Scale podcast, I'm Jill Jackson.
And I'm Dr. Claire Tunis.
Thanks for riding along with us.